he was playing pickleball. That is the sentence that stops everything. Not the conviction. Not the 15 years spent in a condemned housing unit waiting for a death that the state of California had quietly decided to stop delivering. Not the legal battles still grinding through the courts more than 2 decades after Christmas Eve 2002. The sentence that makes you pause, the detail that refuses to sit quietly beside everything else you know about this case, is that on a Sunday morning in March 2025, Scott Peterson, convicted of murdering his pregnant wife and their unborn son, one of the most despised men in the history of American true crime, was in a recreation yard at a California state prison, chasing a loose ball across a court, paddle in hand, when another inmate looked up, saw him coming, and reacted the way more than a decade inside the California prison system had conditioned him to react. By the time correctional staff deployed chemical agents and batons to stop what happened next, Scott Peterson had been beaten in a prison yard on a Sunday morning by a man who, by his own account, did not even know who he was hitting. When a reporter asked that man why it happened, he gave 4 words. "We will get there. If you are new here, this is Crimes Records, where we go deeper than the headlines and stay longer than the news cycle. Make sure you are subscribed before this story ends, because what is happening to Scott Peterson inside those walls in 2025 and 2026 is something the headlines have not fully told you. Stay with this. Christmas Eve, 2002. Modesto, California. A house on Covina Avenue. A nursery with a name painted on the wall. Connor. A young couple standing at the edge of something that was supposed to be the beginning of everything. Lacey Peterson was 27 years old and 8 months pregnant with her first child. By every outward measure, her life was arranged exactly the way it was supposed to be. She had a home. She had a husband. She had a son coming. She had friends and a mother who loved her, and a neighborhood she moved through with the ease of someone who believed the world around her was fundamentally safe. She had grown up in Modesto, had attended California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, had studied ornamental horticulture, had met her husband there, had built a life that looked from the outside exactly like the life you were supposed to want. She was warm by every account. She was loved. She was 8 months pregnant with a son she and Scott had already named, already given a room, already given a place in the life they were building together. That morning, her husband Scott told police he left the house at approximately 9:30 to drive roughly 90 miles west to the Berkeley Marina on San Francisco Bay. He said he was going fishing, alone, in December, on a cold bay, in a 14-foot aluminum game fisher boat he had purchased just 15 days earlier, on December 9, 2002, and had told almost no one about, including members of Lacey's own family. When he returned that afternoon, the family's golden retriever was wandering the backyard with its leash still attached. The back gate was open. The house was quiet. Lacey was gone. What began as a missing person call to the Modesto Police Department that evening became, within days, one of the most watched criminal investigations in American history. The media arrived in Modesto almost immediately. Candlelight vigils drew hundreds of people into the streets. Lacey's face appeared on television screens across the country. A young, smiling, heavily pregnant woman who had simply vanished on Christmas Eve. The night before the world was supposed to slow down and gather. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, appeared at press conferences barely holding herself together. Scott Peterson stood beside the family. He was composed. Visibly, strikingly composed in a way that, to millions of people watching at home, did not look like grief. People could not agree on what it looked like, but they noticed it. And they kept noticing. The investigation moved quickly, and it moved in one direction. By January 2003, investigators had assembled enough to begin building a picture of what they believed had happened, and that picture did not favor Scott Peterson. The first and most significant piece was a name. Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno, California. Peterson had met her on November 20th, 2002, just over a month before Lacey disappeared. He had told Frey he was not married. As the relationship developed across the weeks that followed, he went further than that. He told her his wife had died. He presented himself as a widower, a man who had lost someone and was now carefully, cautiously beginning to move forward again. Frey had no reason to doubt him. She had no idea there was a pregnant woman at home on Covina Avenue. She had no idea there was a nursery with a name painted on the wall. When she saw Scott Peterson's face on the news as the husband of a missing pregnant woman, publicly appealing for his wife's safe return, she contacted police immediately. She cooperated fully. She allowed investigators to record her ongoing phone conversations with Peterson throughout the search for his wife. Those recordings became one of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence the prosecution would eventually bring to trial. On December 30th to 1st, 2002, while a candlelight vigil for Laci Peterson was being held just miles from the family home, Peterson called Amber Frey. He told her he was calling from Paris. He described the Eiffel Tower. He painted a picture of himself standing in a European city as the new year arrived around him, watching the celebrations, entirely disconnected from the search happening back home. He was not in Paris. He was in or near Modesto, California, and the call was on tape. 4 months after Laci disappeared, the Bay gave back what it had been holding. On April 13, 2003, the partial remains of a male fetus were discovered on the shoreline of San Francisco Bay near Point Isabel in Richmond, California. The following day, a female torso was found approximately 1 mile away near Brooks Island. Both sets of remains were recovered from the same waters adjacent to the Berkeley Marina, the exact body of water where Scott Peterson had told investigators he spent Christmas morning fishing for sturgeon and catching nothing. DNA confirmed what investigators had already begun to believe. Connor Peterson, Laci Peterson, recovered from the exact waters Peterson had placed himself in on the morning his wife vanished. The proximity was not a coincidence in the eyes of investigators. It was the confirmation of a theory they had been building for months. On April 18, 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested at the Torrey Pines Golf Course in La Jolla, California. He had bleached his hair blonde and grown a beard. He was carrying approximately $15,000 in cash, his brother's identification, multiple cell phones, credit cards belonging to Laci's family, camping equipment, and survival gear. Prosecutors said it looked like a man who had already decided he was not coming back. A man in mid-flight. Peterson said he had been driving to play golf and to visit his parents in San Diego. 2 versions of the same moment, separated by everything. The trial began in Redwood City in June 2004. The venue had been changed from Stanislaus County because of the scale of pre-trial publicity. The kind of publicity that made finding an impartial jury in Modesto a practical impossibility. The trial ran for nearly 6 months. It generated daily national media coverage. It became, for millions of Americans, a kind of extended civic event. A case that felt like it was about more than one man and one crime. It felt like it was about grief and betrayal and the specific horror of violence that comes not from a stranger, but from inside the life you built. The prosecution's case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. Both sides acknowledged this openly. There was no murder weapon recovered. There was no confession. There was no direct forensic evidence placing Peterson at the scene of a killing. What prosecutors had was a portrait assembled piece by piece, detail by detail, of a man who had reason to want his wife gone, opportunity to make her gone, and behavior afterward that was consistent, in the prosecution's framing, with a man who already knew what had happened to her. The affair with Amber Frey. The lies constructed around it. The recordings of him telling a woman his wife was dead, while that wife's face was on every news channel in the country. The 14-foot aluminum game fisher purchased 15 days before Laci disappeared, told to almost no one. The fishing trip taken alone on Christmas morning on a cold December bay, with no witnesses and no fish. The cell phone records placing him at the Berkeley Marina that morning. The behavior in the weeks that followed. Inquiries about renting out the family home. Questions about selling Laci's car. A composure in public that the people around him consistently described not as strength, but as an absence of genuine anguish. And then there was the testimony that became the chronological spine of the entire prosecution. A single expert. A single date. At trial, prosecution expert Dr. Charles March testified that, based on ultrasound measurements of Connor's fetal development, using research methodology derived from 1984 scientific literature, Connor's time of death was approximately December 23, 2002. The evening before Peterson's Christmas morning fishing trip. The evening he and Lacey were alone in the house on Covina Avenue. That date was the axis. If Connor died on December 23rd, Lacey died on December 23rd. If Lacey died on December 23rd, only one person was with her. Peterson's own defense attorneys had been candid about the implications in prior legal proceedings. If the timeline was December 23rd, Scott Peterson was the only person who could have done it. The prosecution's entire case radiated outward from that single point on a calendar. The defense, led by Mark Garagos, opened by promising to deliver what he called a mountain of evidence pointing to alternative suspects. That mountain never materialized in the way Garagos had promised, and the gap between the opening and what was actually presented became a problem the defense never fully recovered from. The defense argued that multiple witnesses had reported seeing a woman matching Lacey's description walking the family dog in the neighborhood on Christmas Eve morning, after Peterson had already departed for the marina. If true, that would have placed Lacey alive after he left, making it impossible for him to have killed her at home before his trip. The defense also pointed to a burglary at a nearby home on December 24th, suggesting that whoever was responsible for that crime might have encountered Lacey and abducted her. No hard evidence connected the burglary to Lacey's disappearance. The jury deliberated for 7 days. The process included the dramatic mid-deliberation removal of 2 jurors, including the original foreperson, a development that generated significant controversy about whether the changes affected the dynamic of the room and the speed with which the remaining jurors moved toward a verdict. On November 12, 2004, the reconstituted jury returned its findings. Guilty on count 1, first-degree murder of Lacey Peterson, with a special circumstance of lying in wait, which made Peterson eligible for the death penalty. Guilty on count 2, second-degree murder of Connor Peterson. Outside the San Mateo County Courthouse, hundreds of people who had gathered to wait for the verdict reacted with cheering, with crying, with the release of something that had been building for nearly 2 years. Juror number 7, Rochelle Nice, told reporters that San Quentin was Scott Peterson's new home. She said it with satisfaction. She did not appear to have any doubt. On March 16, 2005, Judge Alfred DeLucchi formally sentenced Scott Peterson to death. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, which sits on the western shore of Marin County overlooking San Francisco Bay. The same water, the same body of water where Lacey and Connor's remains had been recovered 2 years earlier. Whatever the architects of California's justice system intended by that geography, the cruelty of it was not lost on anyone watching. San Quentin was home to California's death row. It was where the state kept the men it had formally decided to kill. And now Scott Peterson was one of them. Death row cells at San Quentin measured approximately 4 feet by 10 feet, roughly the size of a large bathroom. Inside that space, a condemned man had a cot, a toilet, and whatever personal items the facility permitted. He was allowed out for a few hours a day, sometimes less. Every single time he left that cell, he was handcuffed. Not because of anything he had done that day, not because of a specific incident or a specific threat, because that was the rule for condemned men, applied every time without exception. When condemned men moved through San Quentin's corridors and walkways, general population inmates were required to face the wall, not because condemned men posed a greater physical threat than anyone else in the building, but because the architecture of death row was built on the principle of total separation. Condemned men did not mix with general population. They did not share spaces, share meals, or share yard time. They existed in a parallel layer of the facility, visible to the institution but sealed off from the rest of it. The isolation was not incidental. It was the design. California had not executed an inmate since January 17, 2006, when Clarence Ray Allen was put to death by lethal injection. In the years that followed, multiple legal challenges to the state's execution protocol effectively froze the process. The state kept sentencing men to death. It stopped carrying out those sentences. The result was a population of more than 700 condemned, men who knew what their sentence was, but could not know when or whether it would ever be carried out, because the state that had issued the sentence had quietly stopped fulfilling it. For some men on California's death row, by documented account, the accumulated weight of that uncertainty became something they could no longer carry. Some stopped filing appeals not because they had run out of legal arguments, not because they had accepted guilt, but because the waiting, the relentless daily reality of existing in a 4x10 cell, handcuffed every time you leave it, invisible to the rest of the facility by deliberate design with no meaningful human contact, waiting for a date that kept getting pushed further into a future that might never arrive, became something they chose to end rather than continue enduring. Scott Peterson waited in those conditions for more than 15 years. In August 2020, the California Supreme Court issued a ruling that changed his sentence, but not his conviction. The court found that during the 2004 jury selection process, potential jurors who had expressed general opposition to the death penalty had been improperly dismissed before the trial began. The court's finding was that those dismissals had contaminated the composition of the penalty phase jury, the jury that decided not whether Peterson was guilty, but whether he should die for it. The guilty verdicts on both counts were left entirely untouched. The finding that he had murdered Lacey and Connor Peterson stood without alteration. What the court vacated was the sentence alone: death. The Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office, in consultation with Lacey's family, announced it would not seek to reinstate the death penalty. Lacey's family said publicly that another trial was simply too painful to go through again. On December 8, 2021, Scott Peterson appeared in a San Mateo County courtroom for formal resentencing. Sharon Rocha stood in that room. She faced the man convicted of killing her daughter. She told him she had observed no sorrow and no remorse from him in 19 years. She told him that no matter what any court decided going forward, two things would never change. Lacey and Connor would always be dead, and he would always be their murderer. Lacey's sister, Amy Rocha, also addressed him. She told him it made her sick to be in that room with him again. Peterson sat in silence throughout. Judge Anne Christine Masulo sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There is no parole board hearing built into that sentence. There is no date circled on a calendar. There is no mechanism by which future conduct or changed circumstances can generate release. Life without the possibility of parole in California is a sentence that ends one way and one way only, when the person serving it stops breathing. This is Crimes Records. And if this story is reaching you the way these stories are meant to reach you, take a moment right now to subscribe and leave a like on this video. Every one of them tells us this work is finding the people it was made for. Now stay with this, because what happens next is the part the headlines skipped. In October 2022, more than a year after the formal resentencing, Scott Peterson was transferred from San Quentin State Prison to Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California, a medium to high security facility approximately 40 miles southeast of Sacramento in Amador County. The delay between resentencing and transfer reflected the administrative complexity of reclassifying and relocating a high-profile inmate through California's correctional system. His attorney, Pat Harris, spoke to reporters about the move. He said Peterson would be around more people. He would have access to programs, to yard time, to shared spaces. Harris called it more of a normal prison life. That word, normal, is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. And it deserves more than a passing glance, because the difference between what Peterson was leaving at San Quentin and what he was arriving at in Mule Creek is not simply a difference in locations or facilities or programming options. It is a fundamental difference in the conditions of daily existence, in who could be near him, and in what that proximity actually meant for a man whose face was among the most recognized in the American criminal justice system. On death row at San Quentin, Peterson had lived under near total enforced isolation. The condemned housing unit separated him from every other category of inmate by deliberate institutional design. He could not move freely through the prison. He could not interact with general population inmates. He was, by the architecture of the facility itself, inaccessible to the rest of it. No one could get close to him because the system had been built to prevent it. Mule Creek is a different world entirely. In general population, inmates eat in the same dining hall. They use the same recreation yard. They have access to educational programs, vocational training, religious services, and rehabilitative programming. Men in general population develop routines. They form relationships, functional ones, strategic ones, occasionally genuine ones with the people around them. By every measurable metric, general population is less restrictive than condemned housing. More access, more movement, more of what most people would recognize as a human daily existence. But general population also means something that death row, in its brutal and suffocating way, had protected against. Proximity to other men. And proximity, for a man with Scott Peterson's profile, his history, his notoriety, the specific nature of what he was convicted of doing to a pregnant woman and her unborn son, is not a neutral condition. It carries weight. It carries consequences. Mule Creek State Prison is not a facility that houses anonymous men quietly serving out unknown sentences. John Albert Gardner, convicted of the murders of 2 teenage girls in San Diego County, is among the high-profile inmates housed there. The facility is designed and staffed for men who will never leave, men serving the longest sentences the California system imposes. When Scott Peterson arrived in October 2022, he was not stepping into a place where no one knew his name. He was stepping into a place where virtually every man on every yard had spent years watching his case unfold on national television, forming opinions about what he had done and reaching conclusions about what he deserved. The Laci Peterson case is not a footnote in American criminal history. It is one of the defining true crime cases of the early 21st century. A young pregnant woman vanishes on Christmas Eve. Her husband was having an affair with a woman he had told his wife was dead. Her body surfaces in the exact bay where he went fishing that morning. The trial plays out on national television for 6 months. The verdict lands like a verdict on everything the case had become. Every man inside Mule Creek, regardless of when he arrived, regardless of what he himself was convicted of, knows who Scott Peterson is and why he is there. Sunday, March 9, 2025. Scott Peterson was in the recreation yard at Mule Creek State Prison. He was playing pickleball. Take a moment with that detail, not as irony assembled for effect, but as a genuine window into what daily life looks like for a man serving life without the possibility of parole in a California state prison. Pickleball has become one of the most widely played recreational sports inside California's correctional system. It requires minimal equipment, a paddle, a lightweight perforated ball, a court that can be marked on any flat surface. It can be organized quickly, accommodated in a standard recreation yard, and played by men across a wide range of ages and physical conditions. For the men at Mule Creek, for any man serving a sentence measured in decades, the yard is not optional. The yard is one of the only spaces where time moves differently, where the body does something other than wait. A ball broke loose from the court. Peterson ran after it, paddle in hand. A fellow inmate named Charles R. Miles was walking on the recreation path at that moment. Miles was 39 years old. He had been in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation since 2011, when a jury convicted him of gang-related murder and a judge sentenced him to 58 years to life. He had spent more than a decade navigating the daily realities of California's prison system, realities in which a man running toward you at speed, carrying something in his hand, represents a specific and unambiguous category of threat. He did not stop to assess the situation further. He did not wait for clarification. More than a decade inside had conditioned the calculation, and the calculation was instantaneous. He attacked. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation confirmed the incident through spokesperson Todd Javernick. The official statement reads as follows. On March 9, 2025, incarcerated person Charles R. Miles was walking on a recreation path at Mule Creek State Prison when he attacked incarcerated person Scott Peterson. Staff immediately responded, using chemical agents and batons to stop the attack. Both Miles and Peterson were medically evaluated, determined to have sustained minor injuries, and were returned to their respective housing. Miles received a serious rule violation for the incident. Chemical agents and batons. That language requires context, because those tools are not deployed to break up a shoving match. They are not the response to a heated exchange that is already de-escalated on its own. They are used when correctional staff determines that a physical confrontation requires immediate, forceful, direct intervention to prevent serious bodily harm. The state of California confirmed in writing that that level of response was necessary to stop what Charles Miles was doing to Scott Peterson on that recreation path. Peterson was medically evaluated inside the facility. His injuries were non-life-threatening. He did not require a hospital transfer. By that same Sunday evening, he was back in his cell. TMZ reported the story on March 11, 2025. Their sources confirmed that Peterson had been beaten and that his injuries, while real, were not serious enough to require outside medical care. Multiple national outlets picked up the story in the days that followed. After the incident, Charles Miles gave a telephone interview to the San Francisco Chronicle from inside the prison. He told the reporter he had not recognized Scott Peterson. He said that when he saw a figure coming at him at speed, carrying what appeared to be a weapon, his response was not calculated. It was instinctive. The official rule violation issued to Miles was for use of force, not premeditation, not targeted assault on a high-profile inmate. The California Department of Corrections classified it as a use-of-force incident on a recreation path, initiated by a case of mistaken identity that escalated before staff could intervene. The reporter asked Miles why he thought it happened. He said 4 words. It was God's plan. Sit with that. A man serving 58 years to life for murder, standing somewhere inside a California state prison, had just attacked Scott Peterson, one of the most despised convicted killers in living American memory, over a runaway pickleball. And when asked to explain it, he offered 4 words. No apology, no regret, no extended reflection on what went wrong in the moment. Just a clean, settled answer. It was God's plan. Not that he wished it had gone differently. Not that he felt any particular way about who Scott Peterson was, or what he had been convicted of. Just that a higher power had arranged the geometry of that Sunday morning, and he had been the instrument through which the arrangement was fulfilled. Those 4 words say something precise and disturbing about the world Scott Peterson wakes up inside every single day. Because Charles Miles, by his own documented account, did not even know who he was hitting. He attacked a man he did not recognize over a misread situation that lasted seconds. The men who do recognize Peterson, the men who have known his face for more than 20 years and formed their own judgments about what he deserves, are on the same yard. They were there the day before. They will be there the day after. There is an argument, not made by Peterson's legal team, not advanced by innocence organizations, but held by people who have spent years inside California's correctional system and years studying it, that life without parole in general population is in certain measurable and non-trivial respects harder to endure than death row. On death row at San Quentin, the isolation was absolute and structurally enforced. The condemned housing unit separated Peterson from every other inmate by deliberate institutional design. He could not be approached by other inmates because other inmates could not get anywhere near him. The condemned housing unit functioned as a permanent, architecturally mandated quarantine from violence, from confrontation, from the full spectrum of social friction that exists wherever human beings are forced to share space under duress. That isolation carried its own specific punishments. The loneliness, the monotony, the way it compressed time and stripped meaning from the hours. Those things were real and well documented. But the isolation was also a wall. And a man behind a wall of that kind cannot be reached by the men on the other side. In general population at Mule Creek, that wall does not exist. Every morning, Peterson wakes up in a facility shared by hundreds of other men. Men who eat in the same dining hall. Men who use the same yard. Men who, unlike Charles Miles on that Sunday morning, know exactly who Scott Peterson is and have known it for more than 20 years. There is no segregation buffering his name and his face from the awareness of every other man on that compound. There is no architectural protection between the most infamous version of his story and the people who carry that story with them into the yard every single day. And unlike men serving 10-year sentences or 20-year sentences or even sentences with a parole eligibility date buried decades in the future, Peterson has no number to count toward. There is no hearing at which good conduct is weighed against the gravity of what he was convicted of. There is no mechanism by which a future version of Scott Peterson might be assessed on who he is now, rather than what a jury decided he did on Christmas Eve 2002. Life without the possibility of parole is exactly that. The only way he leaves Mule Creek State Prison is in a body bag. He knows it. Every man on that yard knows it. And that knowledge, The legally finalized, court-confirmed, institutionally permanent certainty that this building is where his life ends does not lift. Not for yard time. Not for pickleball. Not for anything. The argument that this is harder than death row is not a comfortable one to make in the context of this case. Laci Peterson was 27 years old, with a nursery set up and a name chosen and a life about to begin in the fullest possible way. Connor Peterson never drew a breath outside the womb. He never had the chance to be any age at all. Whatever the texture of Scott Peterson's daily existence inside Mule Creek, whatever it costs him while two people who never got the chance to live their lives at all are in the ground. That is a fact that does not move, regardless of what any court decides or any appeal argues. And yet March 9, 2025, is not simply the story of a prison fight. It is a data point. One documented incident among the undocumented daily reality of being Scott Peterson inside a California state prison. That incident happened on a Sunday morning, initiated by a man who did not even know who he was hitting. The men who do know are still on the same yard. Scott Peterson is not simply sitting inside Mule Creek, waiting for the end. He is fighting. In January 2023, the Los Angeles Innocence Project, one of the most credentialed and respected wrongful conviction organizations operating in the United States, formally announced it was taking his case. The Innocence Project does not take cases as a courtesy or for visibility. Their intake process involves a substantive legal and investigative review. When they announced they were representing Peterson, it sent a clear signal to legal analysts, true crime journalists, and court watchers who follow wrongful conviction work closely. Someone with serious resources and serious credibility had looked at the record and concluded there was something worth fighting for. In August 2025, the Los Angeles Innocence Project filed a habeas corpus petition, a formal legal challenge arguing that Peterson was wrongfully convicted based on what the petition called false scientific evidence. The core of the argument was a direct attack on the fetal development testimony used by the prosecution at trial, the testimony that had placed Connor's time of death on December 23, 2002, and made Scott Peterson the only person who could have killed Laci. At Peterson's 2004 trial, prosecution expert Dr. Charles March had testified that, based on ultrasound analysis drawing on research methodology from 1984, Connor's gestational development placed his time of death at December 23rd. That single date was the axis around which the entire prosecution case rotated. If Connor died on December 2003, Laci died on December 2003. If Laci died on December 23rd, there was only one person with her. The Innocence Project's 2025 petition argued that the science the prosecution relied on was not simply outdated. It was inaccurate in ways that directly affected the outcome of the trial. The petition presented an analysis by a senior radiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, applying current fetal development methodology. That analysis reached a materially different conclusion. Under the updated methodology, Connor's likely time of death fell between December 28, 2002 and January 5, 2003, a window of more than a week after Christmas Eve, during which multiple other individuals had access and opportunity, a window that opens the door to alternative suspects, a window that collapses the timeline that had made Peterson the only possible person who could have done it. The petition also disclosed something significant. The prosecution's original expert, when interviewed by Innocence Project investigators in 2024, 2 decades after the trial, acknowledged that had he based his analysis on more recent scientific research, his conclusions about the date of Connor's death could have been different. Not would have been. Could have been. But the acknowledgement existed. The prosecution's own witness, 20 years later, was conceding that the methodology he used in 2004 was not the only methodology available, and that a different methodology might have produced a different answer. That is not an exoneration, but it is a crack in the foundation that the entire case was built on. On April 28, 2026, California Superior Court Judge Elizabeth Hill denied the petition. Her ruling did not engage the science on its merits. Instead, she found that the evidence presented was not legally new, that similar arguments had been raised in a 2015 habeas petition, and that the expert whose analysis formed the backbone of the current challenge had indicated, even at that earlier stage, that he could have testified to the same conclusions at the original 2004 trial had anyone contacted him. Because the argument could have been raised earlier, California habeas law barred it from being raised now. The claims were procedurally foreclosed, the judge ruled, regardless of their substantive weight. The Los Angeles Innocence Project responded with a direct public challenge to that reasoning. Deputy Director Hannah Brown stated that the organization disagreed with the ruling on every level. She said the court had misapplied the legal standard, that the threshold for habeas review is not whether evidence is admissible but whether it is sufficient to undermine confidence in the verdict, and that strong exculpatory evidence had been turned away at the door on procedural grounds. The Innocence Project announced it would appeal to a higher court. Peterson also has a separate appeal working its way through the California Supreme Court, one focused not on forensic science, but on the conduct of a juror. That appeal centers on Rochelle Nice, juror number 7 in Peterson's original trial, the same juror who told reporters after the verdict that San Quentin was Scott Peterson's new home. Peterson's legal team alleges that Nice concealed relevant personal history on her juror questionnaire during the 2004 selection process, history that, if disclosed, would have provided grounds to disqualify her from sitting on the case. The specific allegations concern her failure to disclose that she had been the victim of a crime and that she was involved in a civil lawsuit during jury selection. If those allegations are accurate, the argument is that Peterson was denied his constitutional right to an impartial jury. As of May 2026, the California Supreme Court had not issued its ruling. Former federal prosecutor Niama Rahmani assessed the legal landscape at the close of 2025 with measured candor. He acknowledged the challenges were real but called them narrow. He said overturning a conviction as old, as extensively litigated, and as circumstantially grounded as Peterson's required a level of proof that the available evidence had not yet produced. That is where the case stands. The Innocence Project is in the appeals process. The juror misconduct question is before California's highest court. And Scott Peterson is waking up at Mule Creek every morning while the fight continues outside the walls. A source described by People magazine as a Peterson family friend spoke about his state of mind inside the facility. The source said Peterson's spirits were, in their characterization, pretty high. He has the attitude, the source said, that he did not do anything wrong. He is waiting, according to this account, for the day when he can come out and perform what the source called his ha-ha dance. The moment he walks free and tells the world he was right all along. The ha-ha dance. That is the image Scott Peterson is living toward, if you believe the people around him. A man inside a California state prison, serving life without the possibility of parole, playing pickleball in a yard full of men who have formed their own verdicts about him, sustaining himself on the vision of a door that opens. There is no door. Life without the possibility of parole does not have one. The only exit is the one no one chooses for themselves. He knows it. The legal record confirms it. Every court that has reviewed his conviction, every judge who has examined the evidence, the procedure, the science, the juror conduct, has reached the same conclusion. Scott Peterson is 53 years old. He has been in continuous custody since April 18, 2003. He has been sentenced to death and watched that sentence disappear on a procedural ruling. He has been formally resentenced to life by a judge, while Lacey's mother told him to his face what he would always be. He has been transferred from a condemned housing unit where isolation was the architecture to a general population facility where every man on the compound has had 2 decades to form a view about what he deserves. He has been beaten in a recreation yard by a man who did not even recognize him. He has had his habeas petition denied on procedural grounds, despite evidence his own supporters called exculpatory. And he is waiting for an appeals court ruling and a California Supreme Court decision that have not yet come for something, anything, to move. 2 people who cannot wait for anything are at the center of this story. They have been from the beginning. Lacey Peterson was 27 years old. There was a nursery on Covina Avenue. There was a name on the wall. Connor Peterson never drew a breath outside the womb. He never had the chance to become any age at all. Whatever the courts decide going forward, whatever the Innocence Project finds in the appeals process, Whatever the California Supreme Court concludes about juror number 7, whatever updated science eventually determines about a date of death, two facts remain permanent. They do not bend under legal argument. They do not shift with appellate rulings. They do not move. Lacey and Connor Peterson are gone, and Scott Peterson is at Mule Creek. And on March 9, 2025, it was God's plan. The April 2026 ruling is being appealed. The California Supreme Court has yet to issue its decision on the juror misconduct question. When either of those developments breaks, Crimes Records will be here with the full coverage. If this story reached you the way these stories are meant to reach you, if it landed and stayed and made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it, not because it is comfortable, but because the cases that are hardest to sit with are often the ones most worth understanding. Subscribe to Crimes Records right now if you are not already part of this community, and leave a like on this video before you go. Every single one of them tells us this work is reaching the people it was made for. We will be back when the story moves.